All right, I think we have, okay, we are on time. So as Swiss, we always have tried to start at the right time. So it's my name is Patrick Fry. I'm the CEO and founder of Venture Valuation. We are running this Biotechgate digital partnering. Yeah, it's a pleasure for me to welcome the two speakers, Matthias and Shwen, who will talk about, actually I have to quickly check the topic, the business model on digital therapeutics. Yeah, we have a number of sessions actually today, so I just had to make sure I got the right one. Yeah, we have a whole 5 days of digital partnering, and we have a number of sessions going on. And yeah, it's a pleasure to also introduce Christian, who will lead this panel. And over to you.
Thanks, Patrick. Guys, it's a pleasure to be here. So by way of background, Patrick and I have known each other about 20 years. He mentioned Venture Valuation. For those of you that don't know, they are a valuations company in the life sciences, and a very good one. But they've been running in-person partnering meetings at some of the top biotech and health sector partnering conferences for almost, but not quite 20 years now, and developed one of the best platforms. So those of you doing the partnering in the system are getting a sense of the online version. They also do this in person. Why am I here? That is because we have a nice collaboration with Venture Valuation, and I'm going to share my screen just briefly. Why are we doing a stream on neurodigital and AI and mental health issues at this event? It's because one of the initiatives we run, and we held in October in Lisbon, and we'll do again next October in Lisbon, was the Neurodigital and AI Innovation Summit. And Biotechgate was a key strategic partner and provided the partnering platform there. So we're providing a few sessions here to give people a taste of what we did. I'll introduce our speakers in a moment. One of them was there, one of them couldn't make the dates, but we should have an interesting discussion. Maybe not quite as interactive as in person because we're online, but we'll touch on some similar issues. And I wanted to say our partners very briefly were the Champalimaud Foundation, which is that beautiful venue you see on the screen. They are a top neurology research center and clinic in Lisbon, and the European Brain Council. And we also had support from Cambridge Cognition, Medable, the Brain Capital Alliance, eBrains, the Human Brain Project, and the Applied Neuroscience Association, amongst others. I'm going to stop sharing this. I hope you can all join us in person for the in-person partnering next year, but that is the link, and that is why at this Biotechgate digital partnering, there is a neuro and digital stream, and I'm glad you're all here. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers. We have, and I'll come back to each of you to introduce yourselves in a bit more detail, but we have Dr. Matthias Zenker, who is the Chief Scientific Medical Officer at GAIA AG, which is one of the original digital therapeutics companies. And we're going to have a chance to go through the GAIA story here. And then we have Shwen Gwee, who is an innovation advisor in digital health and corporate innovation, and was formerly the global head of digital strategy for Bristol Myers Squibb, and before that, the co-founder of BIOME and open innovation at Novartis. So he works with startup and growth companies and VCs, but also has a deep industry background on the digital health and digital strategy side. So I guess to kick things off, Matthias, can I ask you to give us a little bit of info on yourself, your own background, even prior to GAIA, and then how long you've been there, and then we'll come back to the GAIA story in a separate question.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Christian. Actually, there's not much history before GAIA. I'm the Chief Scientific Medical Officer for GAIA, basically overseeing our digital products. I'm a physician by training. Background in pediatric surgery, but left the clinical pathway rather early after working a couple of years in hospitals and in outpatient settings. And yeah, I'm now 21 years with GAIA, and so there's not much time before that. I'll probably, as you said, we're going to touch base on the history of GAIA. And so my job basically is from the clinical part, overseeing our products and corporations internationally and also national here in Germany. So I'm happy to join the conversation. I was the one who wasn't able to make the dates in Lisbon, as Christian said. It was just too short notice for me. But I've heard that it has been a wonderful inaugural event, and hopefully can make it next year in October. I'm gonna pencil in the dates, Christian.
We will give you the dates within 2 weeks. They'll be in October. We're just trying to coordinate with some other event organizers to not have head-to-head conflicts for some other nice events, which are quite different, but we'd rather not overlap. So you'll get a good 10 months or more of notice. But yeah, it came together very quickly, and we were lucky that we had speakers like Shwen, who you'll meet in a moment, who were able to come. Some with 2 or 3 weeks notice, some with 2 months notice, but that is about it, right? And we still managed to have a really fantastic lineup of KOLs, innovators, decision makers, and some great conversations. So I hope everybody can join next year. Shwen, I introduced you briefly, but I don't think I did it justice. You've been in digital health for a long time, but as you see from Matthias, some people have been there even longer, which is not something we run into too often. But can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your own background?
Sure. Thanks, Christian. And thank you for having me here. I've spent the last almost 20 years now in the biopharma industry. And prior to that, I was actually training to be a behavioral neuroscientist. So the event that you ran is definitely something that's very close to my heart. But over the last 20 years in biopharma, I've really focused on digital strategy and innovation. My first sort of 12 or 13 years were focused more on the commercial side, digital marketing, strategy, innovation in that space, whether it's in brand teams or in centers of excellence or at the corporate level, and both on the biopharma client side as well as on the creative agency side. And then I switched over for about 3 years to the clinical innovation side. So really sitting within clinical development teams and leading digital strategy for recruitment and retention of clinical trials. And then the last 5 years or so, I've been really focused on enterprise-wide digital innovation. Firstly, with Novartis, as you mentioned, as a co-founder of the BIOME, really partnering with internal teams to co-found, launch, and grow a global network of digital innovation hubs, including places like UK, France, Spain, India, Canada, and so on. And then more recently at BMS, Bristol Myers Squibb, where I basically partnered with all the different senior leaders across the business units, whether it's R&D, clinical, commercial, manufacturing, supply chain, to really help drive their digital innovation strategy. And I left BMS in May and have taken some time off and have taken on way too many advisory roles with startups at this point. But I will say that, I knew about GAIA probably 6 or 7 years ago. I first came across them because I was advising a conversational AI startup, and I realized that a lot of the basic foundation of what you were doing at GAIA was also based on conversational AI and chatbots as part of the digital therapeutic sort of modality. And so for me, GAIA is one of the first companies I've sort of known in this space, and so very excited to be here with you, Matthias.
Thank you, Jim. Likewise.
So guys, as you can see, we have some we have 2 speakers, but we have some deep expertise here. And we're going to dive into a few things. Yesterday, we talked about the investor perspective in digital health broadly. Today, we wanted to dive into digital therapeutics within digital health in the neuro and brain space. Matthias, I said we'd touch on the GAIA story. So I think people are getting a sense that GAIA has been around a long time for a company in digital health. And you guys actually developed the first approved digital therapeutic. So can you take us back and tell us a little bit, what was the impetus of that, sort of the founding and how that started? And then maybe not the full 20+ year history, but how that's evolved, the brief version, and then we'll dive into the Q&A. And I also want to say to the audience, as we get into the Q&A, you can use the the Q&A chat function to submit your questions. We will take them. We had a lot of interaction yesterday, so I won't run out of questions, but feel free to ask yours. It may be better, more interesting than my question, or you just may want to know the answer. So jump in. If I really don't like your question, we may skip it, but that very rarely happens. So I do encourage you to jump in with those. Matthias?
Of course. Well, thank you. So GAIA was founded exactly 25 years ago, founded by physicians and rooted in universal healthcare, right? Where you have large populations of people with large problems. And you come quite quickly to the point where if you want to scale in a given setting, you need technology. And we basically had the luck that we met people back then in the tech space, which was Airbus, the aircraft manufacturer, who wanted to do something in this medical field. And it's a tech company, so it has to do with tech, and the rest is basically anecdotes. We started back then with the first product. Nobody called it digital therapeutic back then, right? But it was basically, it has no name at all. It was basically, but it was what it is today as well. It was software that helps people to get better, to change behavior towards the better, towards clinical outcomes. It was a successful project where we then started on step by step developing the first products. And then basically what happened is a similar situation we have today, almost 20 years later, is the payer organization said, wait a minute, if you want to get this reimbursed, you have to prove that it's effective and safe. You have to show that it has a clinical effect. So that was the time when we then started back in the early 2000s, run first clinical trials, because that is still the gold standard of proving effectiveness and safety of a product. And then the next step happened is, oh, wait a minute, if it proves in a clinical, if it proves in an RCT that is effective and safe, and you use it in healthcare, that is a medical device, right? So next step was how to get this so this step by step over the last 20 years, fast forward to 2022, here we are these days. We're still an R&D company at heart. Our DNA is R&D for digital therapeutics, now based in Europe, because Europe is more and more becoming a Europe health space in terms of digital therapeutics. Germany on the forefront, but France trailing quite quickly behind in other companies. So it's basically a European look at the system now. And in the US, with our office now in Cambridge, mainly for R&D purposes. Behavioral health was always the core, the classic, and you see if you look on the global scale, most of the products in the space, also under the GAIA system in Germany, are behavioral health, because that was the most the classic indication for digital therapeutics. But what we see now is furthermore, and also for ourselves, is to move more into classic other indications as well. But that was basically the path of the last 22 years. And on a side note, when we first saw the first draft of the bill for the German general reimbursement, I didn't believe that this is going to happen in my lifetime. And I'd never expected that to happen, to see general reimbursement in any healthcare system in the world for digital therapeutics. But then some good things, came together to at the speed on that, and here we are in Germany, Europe, but also the tendencies we see in the US as well. So here we are.
On the technology side, I think Elon Musk said something, if you ask somebody in the 1980s what the 2020s would look like, everyone thought we'd have flying cars and so forth. So maybe the technology doesn't advance that fast, but if we're looking at the ecosystem and the innovation side, I think there is a human tendency to overestimate what can be accomplished in 1 or 2 years in the short term, and to really underestimate what can happen in 5 or 10 years. And I share that. I've seen that with regards to in Europe funding policy. I remember when in Europe they said we'll never do a single company funding instrument like the SBIRs in the US. And now we have the European Innovation Council Accelerator, which started as the SME instrument, which is the same model, but providing several times as much money to individual companies as the original SBIR version. So it's amazing to see that kind of progress, even if we're looking at some of the same challenges. So when I went through my questions, I deleted a few, and Shwen came back with some feedback and said, you might want to clarify at the start. And it was actually my first question. So can we take a step back and, discuss how we're defining digital therapeutics versus digital health generally and digital medicines? And then maybe even a step beyond that, you mentioned, behavioral therapy, right? And there's cognitive behavioral therapy, which can be a therapeutic or a non-therapeutic, depending on the model. So can we talk a little bit about what we mean by these various terms? Digital health being very broad. And Matthias, you touched on this already with some of the challenges and the regulatory issues, but can I ask you both, just how would you define digital therapeutics versus some of the other models and approaches in digital health?
Yeah, thank you. I tend to lean towards the same definition that the Digital Therapeutics Alliance uses, which is the same as DIME as well, the Digital Medicine Society. Which is really categorizing it into, first, a very broad spectrum of digital health, which is anything that's health and wellness that kind of is enabled by technology, so to speak. And then within that is a smaller subset that we call digital medicines, which is evidence-based versions of those types of health and wellness solutions. And then even smaller within that is what we consider digital therapeutics, which is evidence-based, but also most likely regulatory approved and potentially reimbursed. And for the ones that are reimbursed, you could almost have a separate subset that is called prescription digital therapeutics, PDTs. So you can see it's sort of subsets of each other. So Matthias, I don't know if you agree with that, but that's kind of generally how I frame it in a very general sense.
Well, I'm with you, Shwen. I think one of the things I come across is when people talk about digital health in a broader sense, as you mentioned, is quite often they talk about digitalization in healthcare. So what they basically talk about is you digitalize processes and procedures, but that doesn't necessarily add value to the health aspect of it. They talk about this as well. But otherwise, I'm with you to see, that you shrink it down to a very specific field. Yeah. And where you then separate between, and this is something that drives me personally. We always have to be careful with language, right? So when we talk about digital therapeutics, we're not talking about apps. That is an important thing, because app has the classic connotation of Candy Crush and the 99-cent something in app stores, right? So we have to be careful. There's a whole discussion going as well, so apps on prescription and these sort of things.
Yeah, and Christian, I'll add one more thing. When it comes to let's say corporate organizations, pharma companies, biopharma companies, the question around digital health is, where do you draw the line? So does it include things like decentralized trials or real world data, or even your SAP systems? Is that digital health? Because it is digital enabled for health. So where's the line actually drawn is a question when we talk about this, which is why it gets very confusing when people use the term digital health and digital therapeutics interchangeably.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And, I've been in the biotech and health space for 25 years, but unlike you guys, only about a decade of exposure to digital health. And I remember, maybe 10 years ago, 2012, 13, 14, going to some of the larger meetings in Europe and the US around digital health. And most of it was what Matthias described as really digitizing strategies and processes, right? So a lot of this was communication with patients, fraud detection, billing. And I was trying to understand where it was health, other than that the industry they were serving was health. So I think we can see some clear differentiators there. If we dive in a little bit, because we looked at the issue that in digital health, there is a regulatory and approval aspect, right? When we're talking about digital therapeutics, pardon me. This is an extra challenge, right? This requires extra time, extra evidence, extra, additional financial resources. So it is harder than putting a wellness app into the App Store, right? There's no question. And some of these wellness apps are great, but they are not therapeutics per se. So what if we look at a typical early stage digital health company, and Matthias, you're on the medical and clinical side, but you're not a regulatory professional per se. But what is the development path? What does it tend to look like for a digital health company in terms of time and expenditure to reach approval and a CE mark in Europe? Let's take that first, rather than approval in the US. How much of an additional load in terms of financial requirements and time and development is this versus, taking an app which is designed to improve cognition or to train memory, but is really just put into the App Store as a direct to consumer product with no regulatory approval, with no reimbursement code? If you want to go the digital therapeutic route, what does that tend to look like in terms? Let's take a CE mark in Germany as maybe a classic example, one of the best places to do this.
The classic answer is the one nobody likes. The classic answer is it depends, right? Yeah, I know it's a painful answer. Everybody hates it. But there are many variables you have to take into account, and I think that one of the most important things is, as if you are a startup, an early stage company, you really have, or you should make an early on decision which path you want to go. If you want to be on the wellness side or want to be on the regulatory side, because if you want to switch along the path, that is getting really painful. Right. So if you start to say, I want to be in a wellness because it's easier for me to get, go to market is much faster. And then you decide, well, wait a minute, it might be better for me to be on the regulatory path, on the medical path, to get that switch from the regulatory path and everything behind it. That is really painful. So I think it should start for you early on, and then it really does. It depends on what your product does, what the indication is you want to follow, in which risk class you're under, etc. What is technology using? Quite a lot of path. But this is a strategic decision you should make early on, which path you want to follow. And I fully agree with you. There are, with everything in healthcare, there's a room in market for everything, right? For real drugs and some lifestyle something, you always find people who would buy it and like it and use it, also might benefit. And then you have the far right of the spectrum, where you have highly regulated medical device or drugs or whatever, and a clear path this and this way, and then all the consequences falling out of it. I think it's getting what we see when I talk to people who try to navigate the switch between the wellness path and the regulatory path. If they want to do the switch, that is what they describe as very painful in the pathway. But there's a market for everything in healthcare.
Yeah, and that's very interesting. And I think, as you say, it depends, but it depends on the indication and on how you can have an impact, but then also on the business opportunities. Because let's take for as the polar opposite of Candy Crush, there are behavioral tools which can, for example, reduce risk for dementia and Alzheimer's, right? There are behavioral tools, and these can be put into a digital CBT to help people, especially those at higher risk for whatever reason of dementia, reduce their risk. But it's not a therapeutic per se. And it's very hard to see how this gets a reimbursement code, at least in the near term, but it is valuable. And that is something that, you know, there's a need for it, there's a market for it, but the business model is going to be very different in that you're going to be selling to individual consumers or to employers, or maybe to gyms or to clubs or you know, health networks. You're not going to have a reimbursement code from, you know, and get paid by the payers or the insurance companies per se. But if we look at the, you know, a digital therapeutic to treat a condition or to, you know, either the symptoms or to slow progression or to manage a condition, it's quite different. So there's a business model challenge. So Shwen, I'm going to throw this one to you a little bit. How do you decide that early on? You know, are you targeting a wellness app that may serve a valid medical need, right? And one there's a market willing to pay for, but it's not one that's going to be able to go with a reimbursement path? Or do you target a reimbursement path? There's a trade-off sometimes between efficacy and, you know, the market you want to serve and the business model that you have to employ. So how do you, and I realize you spent most of your time within big pharma looking at how does pharma implement this, but now you're advising a bunch of startup companies. And my advice for startup companies is, if you can get Shwen on board, do it. But eventually he's going to hit an upper limit of how many he can manage. But how would you approach this? How would you look at this question early on? Because it's a fundamental one. And then we can come to, you know, the hybrid companies, which, you know, they're doing a bit of both. They have an app, but they're also trying to develop as a separate business line a therapeutic, which can make sense, can provide revenue, but it also can be a dilution of efforts, right? And the reaction you get to that tends to depend on the audience in the room, right? If it's tech investors, they like the app store approach. If it's health investors, they're not too interested, right? Or if it's clinicians, they want to see a real therapeutic. But how do you look at this from a strategic perspective early on?
Yeah, it's a good question, Christian. And I think just as a quick follow-up to Matthias's answer earlier, I think, it's probably easier to go from regulated to wellness than wellness to regulated, just because you're going from more restrictive to less restrictive in that sense. So that's one thing to think about, is if you think you might go one direction, you might want to start more regulated first, and then decide later on. But to come back to your question, Christian, I think, part of the challenge right now is in traditional medicine, for example, and this kind of feeds into your previous question. There's a lot of studies that kind of show it's about 10 years and $1 to $2 billion to bring a new drug to market, right? Depending on what it is. And the beauty of a digital therapeutic is it probably costs less than that and takes much less time than that. But I won't say it's the same as if we were going to bring a regular app like Candy Crush to market. It's not going to be like that, because so you can kind of see the scale in between. I think the question is, like, what is your solution actually doing? If it's truly therapeutic on one hand, it's probably going to have to follow that regulated path and show the evidence that it's actually demonstrating a therapeutic effect. However, some of the examples you brought up with dementia, for example, is probably the equivalent of, like, if you're in a cardiovascular disease, let's say, exercise and nutrition are important. And we actually, in some cases, we do have reimbursement for that, and some form of understanding for the value of what that contributes, even though they're not necessarily truly therapeutic, they actually prevent or slow down the progression of, right? So I think part of that challenge then in our space right now in digital therapeutics is the maturity of the regulations and reimbursement space, and what evidence they have en masse to really show that these types of solutions, which may prevent or slow down the onset of a very serious condition, actually are going to have that effect and that impact. And until such a point where we have enough numbers and enough data to show that this is effective in doing so, then we can sort of start to think about whether we're actually going to get that paid for and covered in a way that saves us many more millions of dollars if they were to actually develop that condition later on. right? It's just a matter of understanding the impact that the digital solution has, but we need the data and evidence in a large scale before we can actually get there. So I think that's part of the challenge right now with how we're thinking about this, and the opportunity to actually get covered for those costs. And therefore that drives our strategy at this point in time for choosing one or the other. And I think you have to be very careful. And the other challenge, I think, especially from a biopharma standpoint, is the misconception that it has to be one or the other. I think the biggest opportunity for pharma is understanding how the combination, a digital companion along with a drug asset, traditional compound, could actually create a 1 + 1 = 3, or a better outcome at the end of the day than either one alone. And to me, that's where you're actually going to start seeing some fundamental changes and huge impact for the end user, the patient. And then what you need to do, though, is figure out at an early stage, maybe it's phase 2, maybe it's earlier, whether that needs to be regulated to provide that kind of outcome, or whether there's a way to actually develop that doesn't require regulatory approval, but still provide some effect that can actually help the patient drive a better outcome.
So that's you've provided a bunch of points here to dig into, Shwen, and I think the very first thing you said is actually good advice, but controversial. It's easier to go from regulated therapeutic to wellness than vice versa, but that's the exact opposite of what most companies do when they look at both, right? Because it's easier to go wellness first.
Well, it's much cheaper too.
yeah, it's easier initially, but the switch may be much harder, right? Because you're then having to rebuild things rather than just repurpose a subset of what you've already done. But the initial task, for a startup company with a limited amount of money and resources, it seems a lot easier to go with a wellness route first, right? So there's this is the one reason why having this kind of discussion early on is so important. In terms of, let's dive into demonstrating efficacy a little bit. This is going to depend on the indication and on the application and so forth. But we do see a lot of companies that come out as digital therapeutics, and over time they switch to being a clinician tool or being some sort of other digital health application or tool or resource rather than a therapeutic, simply because the data required to demonstrate efficacy requires too large a data set, too many patients, it's too expensive, it's too challenging. How do you get a sense of this early on? What, other than looking at what your regulatory path is for a CE mark or for FDA approval, how do you, as an early and Matthias, I realize it's a long time since GAIA has been an early stage company, but you started with Airbus as a partner, which probably helps. But how does an earlier stage company assess? Because a lot of them seem to think they're going to get this data and it's going to require X amount of time and money, and then they realize they need to do significantly more. Right, the data just doesn't come through this in as strongly as they expected, right, to demonstrate clinical efficacy. So how do they plan for that? How do they get a sense of this early on? And I guess we can look at this from the medical side and also the business model side. And Shwen, your perspective may be more along the lines of what industry is going to want to see, and Matthias, it may be more along the lines of how are you designing the strategy so that you're going to get the clinical evidence that you need?
Maybe a couple of things which I think are important. The one thing is, if you have an evidence-based therapy, so digitalizing an evidence-based therapy doesn't necessarily mean that your digital therapeutic then is effective as well, right? That is a very important thing. So just because you digitalize something which is proven to be effective doesn't necessarily mean that your digital therapeutic is effective. Along this way, many things can happen, to the better or the worse. So this is something people have to keep in mind. It's not, take something and put it into a digital form doesn't necessarily mean that your digital therapeutic is then effective. And the second thing is exactly, I would turn, Christian, what you just said, I just turn it around, is make yourself aware that generating RCT proven evidence takes time and effort. What I've seen over the years when I spoke to startups and people who, you know, just jumped into the field is sometimes I get the impression people think that healthcare is the last industry where we have not fully digitalization or whatever. Everything else, hospitality, flying, and everything else is maybe digitalized in a way. And healthcare is still there, right? Healthcare is still a field where you can get on digital in the digital field, and they just underestimate or have not the right people around them what exactly this means. Running clinical trials, even with the possibilities Shwen just mentioned before, the decentralized clinical trials, what you can do there are quite a few companies, a huge field in the US right now, it's coming up there as well. Even with this field, which reduces costs compared to classic clinical trials and increases speed in most of the times. Even then, it takes efforts. You have to plan that. You have to plan for generating evidence for your product. I think this is a very important thing if you think about going into this route. If you make the decision to say you want to be in the regulated pathway, you want to do the RCT pathway, you want to do the medical device pathway, it's healthcare is a beast. It always has been, and I'm pretty sure it will for many more years. Healthcare can be a super tanker. It's really slow and steady in the terms of how it develops and changes. And that is also true for evidence generating clinical trials, regulated pathways. So to be aware of this when you go into this field is one of the key aspects I would always give people who think about going into the space, get up and running your own product. And it's basically exactly what you say. It's easier than to say, wow, we skip that, all this nasty stuff, and just move into the wellness part where we don't need everything, right? It's just go there, have a nice solution there. But if you go down the regulated healthcare digital therapeutic route, that's the tail you're gonna get with you on what you have to do. Shwen, I don't know if you see that differently.
No, I totally agree. I think, there's a lot of different challenges, especially if you're coming at it from more of a corporate enterprise biopharma kind of side as well, because, I think there's a lot of companies that are doing different things right now. They're doing venture investing, they're doing partnerships, both commercially as well as R&D side of things. And then they're also building their own type of digital therapeutic platform. So it's interesting to see the wide variety of different vehicles by which they are working to bring digital therapeutics to market. But I think to the question that you asked, Christian, I think one of the key principles for deciding which path to take is really adopting more of an innovation process, which is don't be stuck on the one thing you think your solution is going to be built for. And you have to try several things before you can figure out what it's actually going to do. So you may think it's going to be a digital therapeutic, but if you don't test it in different environments and see where you're going to get either the best adoption, the best effect, the best outcomes, you won't know for sure where you're actually going to have the biggest impact. And I think if you're stuck with just saying, part of the challenge with pharma is we're used to this mindset of going from RFP to implementation, meaning we already know what we want to build and we know what the final product should look like. So we're just going to RFP it to the builders, have the builders build it, and we'll launch it. And so, several years and a few $1 million later, we launched this product and we realized it's a big failure because it wasn't right. But we didn't test it along the way to see whether it actually worked. And then on top of that, to Matthias's point, healthcare is a beast. I always say, with pharma, the hardest thing is this: the people that use the product, the people that pay for the product, and the people that actually we have to sell to are three different people, right? The patient, the provider, and the payer. And so there's upstream and downstream things you need to think about too. Even though your product may work well, can you get the reimbursement? Will the providers actually adopt this? Does it fit into their workflow? So you have to think about all these upstream and downstream impacts as well before you know whether you can truly be successful. And that's why the small experiments, the testing and learning, the adoption curve, and understanding where people sit along that, I think those are all huge. I mean, think about how many apps actually succeed in the App Store, not health apps, just regular apps. I'd say what, 90-something% probably fail, and only a small handful. So in the same way, I think every digital health solution can't be a success. I think you have to figure out the right models and the right ways to get things done in this very complex matrix of healthcare systems to really succeed well. And so there's a lot to think about, a lot of experiments to try, and a lot of hypotheses to come up with in order to solve for those things.
So Shwen, I think those are really good points, and this is not easy. And you know, even if we take people, so Matthias, to your earlier point, I remember a decade ago when I first looked at digital health, there were a lot of people coming out of the tech background saying we're going to fix healthcare, right? And coming in, and it was a big mess at first, and a year later they were kind of all saying, well, now we're HIPAA compliant, so it'll be fine. But it still wasn't scratching the surface, right? But even then, if you look at companies which came in from a clinical development side and said, in this chronic disease, let's try digital health as a, you know, with a behavioral solution, and we should be able to, they still had challenges, right? Maybe around efficacy and demonstrating efficacy, maybe around business model, you know, and addressing those three different people Shwen mentioned, maybe around margins and scalability, or maybe around, you know, getting buy-in, their first channel for their first use case with a health system or a hospital or a self-insured company. So it's not easy. And I'm not going to name companies and you know, point them out here, but I think if I say, even in the US, where companies have done, you know, 80 to 100 million between their Series A and Series B, and they have rock star teams of incredibly talented people with deep technological and clinical backgrounds, and they came out with a really solid plan to say, we are going to target this indication, or we are going to help patients with X. Some of them have run into challenges. Either their treatment paradigms did not yield the evidence they expected, even with 100 million in cash, you know, to deploy, or their business model just didn't work. And we've seen pivots from things from, you know, from being a digital therapeutic to let's fill prescriptions online digitally, right? And which comes with its own set of headaches and challenges as well. But that's another issue. The point is, even with a rock star team and massive amounts of funding, which the typical startup in the US and certainly in Europe does not have, you know, 100 million. They probably don't have 10. They may have 2 or 3, or they may have a 500,000 to start. So it is possible to get these things wrong, and there's no ironclad, you know, fail-proof solution. And Matthias, as you said, demonstrating efficacy in RCT in clinical trials, whether distributed or centralized, it's not easy, right? And the expected outcomes may not be what you see, even if you're just changing from you know, an in-person treatment to a digitized approach. So what are some of the things, and this is going to be a very general question because I think you've touched on them as well, looking at the business model. But if we switch and say, who is the customer for what you're doing? Are you looking to sell directly into a health system with a reimbursement code to the payer, or should you be looking at another approach? If you're looking at a health system and a reimbursement code, in terms of the cost and time to get there and a viable business model, and Matthias, I appreciate this is probably your colleagues looking at, you know, pricing and you know, market development and so forth. But we often see a scalability issue in digital health where you can get into maybe a pilot program in Germany and you have 8 or 10 or 30,000 patients, but you're probably not going to hit break even until you get 400,000 or 500,000. or 1 million patients. And there are not that many health systems where you can do that, because even in larger countries, they're often regional or fragmented, even with a national, nationalized universal healthcare, right? So how do you look at that early on and get a sense? And Shwen, this may be more on the business side for you, and we could turn it around. How would industry, how would pharma look at this when they're approached by a potential partner saying, we've got this great solution? Do they look at the economics of it the same way, or do they look at it as a companion to their existing product lines, or a bit of both?
Yeah. Do you want me to take that first, or you want Matthias to?
I think I realize it's a step aside from Matthias, but I'm willing to bet his colleagues in marketing and drag him into the conversations on occasion as well. So even if it's not your core focus, you're familiar with it. But I'll leave this for whichever of you wants to take it, because I think it's a very tricky one.
Maybe I'll steal a little bit of the question that was targeted at Matthias to answer that, in the sense that I think part of the challenge, like I said earlier, was the maturity of regulatory and reimbursement, sort of where we are in that space right now globally. Even with Germany being probably the most forward in this space with DIGA and almost guaranteed reimbursement if you get approved, there's still a limit to how much they're willing to reimburse. In fact, I don't think I've seen an approval go above an average of about 250 euro for reimbursement, right? And I think that's far less than you would traditionally get for the same indication for a traditional drug asset, let's say. And so how does that compare, and how does that limit your actual revenue total when you've also got hundreds of millions of investment so far, right? So is the only opportunity to succeed and exit through acquisition or so on, so I think that's one of the business models you have to think about. On the pharma side, I think part of it is, that's why I mentioned earlier that the idea of a digital companion to a traditional drug asset is probably the most compelling form of how we in the biopharma space should be thinking about where digital health could fit. And the reason for that is because ultimately the traditional drug model is something we all understand. We all know the way it works. We all understand the cost and revenue model. And if you can enhance the outcomes for the patient, better outcomes, better experience overall, and drive the efficacy of the actual traditional drug product, what you're doing is continuing to provide evidence for the value of your product, and therefore make a better argument for your market access, for your reimbursement, and so on and so forth. And it may even extend, for example, the duration of your patients being on your drug, or better compliance, or better effectiveness. Like, all these things add to additional revenue for your traditional product, which is really what you understand best. Being as early as we are in the reimbursement space for digital therapeutic, to treat it as a standalone business model and how we're going to actually make money on that as a pharma or a biopharma company, I think that has yet to be proven and yet to really play out in a way that we really understand what model to pursue yet.
So sorry, Matthias, if you had a comment, go ahead.
No, I just Shwen basically nailed it. I mean, I know it sounds mundane, and especially for each and everybody who's in this session, but we all have to keep in mind that digital therapeutics is a whole new treatment modality in healthcare. It is not the next antibiotic. It is not the next with a different, mode of action or something where everybody would say, yeah, somehow it's completely new in each and every phase. It's completely new. And I think all of us are very lucky to be in this time when how often do you have this, that a complete new treatment modality appears in healthcare? How often does that happen during a lifespan? So if you like the risk and it's something in terms of innovation, it's a good time to be in healthcare. And now out of this, everything falls out of that, right? It's like, how to implement, how to reimburse, pricing, everything falls out of it. I think we always have to try to remember this when we got stuck in daily business, is that it's a complete new treatment modality. And even, you were talking about pilots, even under universal healthcare, we have payers in Germany, they have more pilots than the Lufthansa. Okay, there's just unbelievable what they do. Might come from their, being risk averse and try to figure things out and try what is the best pathway, etc., etc. And I think this happens. Almost everything is 10 times in the US. Everything is 10 times more than Germany. I think everything. The whole healthcare system in terms of volume is 10 times Germany, and complexity probably is maybe 10 times. I don't. Sometimes I got the feeling. So everything's much bigger than, right? So that is absolutely understandable. One thing that helps us over the years is our solutions are fully automated solutions. We develop web app technology, so our systems run in the browser. We don't need any app stores or anything. They run in the browser and they are run fully automated. We generate the evidence for the product like for a pill. That's what we do. So and that adds the flexibility in terms of how you integrate it into healthcare settings. It comes a bit of our history that nobody really know how to do it, and we have to keep it easy. And that is basically where we say it has to prove that it's effective and safe, even without any support or any integration. And then you can see how that works. But I'm fully with you. That is, and what you described, Shwen, is what we hear from pharma companies as well when we're talking about potential partnerships in this or this indication. So fully agree.
To be fair, Matthias, from my experience, I think Lufthansa has excellent pilots.
I would agree. I would agree. Guys, maybe two questions, and one of them is shifting gears a little bit because we're talking about digital therapeutics, but there are some related challenges with digital diagnostics, right? Or sort of health tech diagnostics. So I mentioned the interventional approaches, and there are a lot of great companies with tools, behavioral and other, to reduce risk factors for dementia and cognitive decline and so forth. But there are also diagnostics, right, where they're using, it may not be an app on a phone, but they're using digital health technology to diagnose risk factors, right? And there's the similar question: who wants to pay for a diagnosis, right? We have that in the biopharma space as well. We're diagnosing a disease. It's challenging. Is there a need, if we think about that, to maybe pair some of these with the diagnostic, with the risk factor management, in the absence of a true digital therapeutic for some of these indications, right? Because we're seeing things like deep brain implants and neuromodulation, which may be some sort of treatment for some types of dementia, but there's no clear evidence yet that this is a viable treatment in the short term. But risk factor management certainly is, viable. But you have two areas which are potentially incredibly useful and beneficial to patients and at a societal level, but nobody's really willing to pay for in terms of health systems and so forth. Now, Shwen, to your earlier comment, this could be like insurers and health systems paying for gym memberships or providing discounts for active gym goers and so forth, which if you're in the US and paying, especially if you're not on a plan funded by your employer, if you're paying for it yourself, the discount can be quite appealing because the insurance costs are high, right? I mean, you may pay in a month more than a European pays in a couple of years, but there's still no clear established model that works everywhere, even in any one country, in terms of diagnosis and risk management. So again, this is going away from digital therapeutics a little bit, but coming back to business models, I want to ask a more general question. And Shwen, this is something you brought up in Lisbon, which was around channels, sales and distribution channels. How are you getting your solution to market? And I want to ask you to talk about that, and then I think we can ask Matthias, what GAIA's approach is. And I realize that may be geographic market and health system based, at least initially. But Shwen, can you talk a little bit about that? Why is this important? Are companies spending enough time on this and building their strategy early on? And what does it mean in the life cycle of the company?
Yeah. Oh, that's a complex question, Christian. But also I also wish I could answer some of your diagnostic question, because I thought that was a really interesting topic as well. Because I'll touch on that very quickly, and then we'll move on to the business model one. And I think, you know, when you started talking about diagnostics, I think there's probably no condition that does not benefit from being detected earlier in once you've got it, right? Versus once you've got it and fully diagnosed. Most of the time, part of the challenge with our healthcare system is we're only treating after the disease has got to a point where we actually notice something and get diagnosed, and then we can get treated for it. And so it's very much sick care, right? We're treating our sickness once we realize we have it. And so I think as we start to develop things like digital biomarkers and diagnostic tools that can much earlier detect that point of change in our entire behavior, our human cells and systems, how are we going to get that warning signal as early as possible so that we can correct it? Because if we allow that to progress, then the more further it progresses, the more expensive it will probably get to actually correct, manage, treat that condition. And therefore, preventing it early, in some cases, may prevent progression, in some cases, may cure it, in some cases, may just slow it down. So it really depends on what it is. But in any case, in every case, I think getting an early detection and awareness of the fact that you may be progressing down that path is beneficial to everyone. So how can we start to leverage digital biomarkers, or is one example of how I think that space is going to be really important. The question is, who's going to pay for it, and how is it going to be actually leveraged? You can see that in a biopharma standpoint, with certain drugs, you may want to use that so that you can treat further upstream and prevent the progression. And also for R&D, you might want to find it as early as possible so that you may even prevent the disease. On the other hand, you may also want to use it for things like what we call now companion diagnostics, to personalize the medication, so that you kind of know how to segment the patient population so that you can treat one differently from others. And you're seeing this a lot in oncology with genetic tests, right? Specific drugs for specific genotypes. And so that's examples, I think, in that space. So sorry, now I'll flip back to your question that you were asking.
No, but I appreciate that, because I think it's incredibly complex, and having one of the reasons, and this is a short anecdote, but one of the reasons I ended up working on digital health, and we worked in migraine initially, was coming out of a company where we were working on type 2 diabetes and oral antidiabetics, right? And with a really strong clinical team. And that was interesting, but it was a challenging period to do that. So we got to a certain point, and the interesting thing is the biopharma, clinicians around the table looked at this and said, there has to be a better way to treat preventable chronic diseases, right? And type 2 diabetes, if you have in pre-diabetes, intervention is completely curable and even reversible to a certain extent. Everybody knows that, and patients get all the information and they still don't do it. Now, there are some good digital health companies having more of an impact in this space and having a better impact on HbA1c than some of the best treatments in terms of drugs. But that being said, diabetes, the prospect of going blind, of having amputations, of losing a kidney, aren't the same driver for people as being told they're at risk of cancer, right? For whatever reason. And migraine was interesting because it's a chronic disease, but there are acute attacks that patients absolutely want to avoid. So they were motivated to take steps. And I think this is really complex. If we look at neurodegeneration, people that have seen Alzheimer's in their family may be much more attuned to saying, I will take steps to reduce my risk, right? But you're right, in all cases, early intervention has some positive benefit. It might be prevent, even reverse, improve, manage, slow, but the drivers are somehow different, and it is somehow subjective, right? And we look at certain disease areas motivate patients less than others, even if the prospects of type 2 diabetes out of control are really, really scary, right? But 90-something% of patients don't comply with the basic advice. no matter how, what sort of intervention you have. So again, sorry, I didn't want to go too far off topic on that, but I think what you said is incredibly interesting. But let's come back to the channels, right? And path to market and channels, because, and I realize it's a complex question and I wouldn't usually answer it, but you touched on this in Lisbon in a way that I thought was really interesting. So I'd like to tackle it here, and then to look at, GAIA, an established company, and see how they're sort of approaching this in their cases, and their different digital therapeutics. But what were some of your thoughts on this? And feel free just to to freestyle on this, Shwen, because I think even if you don't have an answer.
It's funny, Christian. I was like, I wish I could remember what I said in Lisbon so I could repeat it here.
Sorry.
Maybe I need some memory enhancing digital therapeutics to do that.
Peter Schlecht has that, but it involves an implant.
But I think what you're talking about is just the ways in which biopharma is really partnering with digital therapeutics company or building their own and bringing it to market. And I think there are some early examples of sort of more on the commercial side where they're licensing and partnering and even doing a little bit of the sales on behalf of digital therapeutics, as long as it's associated with their product and helps enhance the outcomes or helps enhance some part of their product. I think in the earlier days, it's been more around digital health solutions that, for example, help drive compliance and adherence to their product regimens. And then more recently, you've seen some digital therapeutics where the sales teams are going out and talking to the providers about how they can leverage digital health products to manage their patients. And so you're starting to see different models. But of course, what has evolved over the last 5 years or so is all the pharma corporate venture arms have started investing in digital health companies as well. So you've got a lot of that venture investment. How aligned that is to their actual corporate strategy and whether they pull them in to be part of that is dependent on the company. It's very different from one company to another. And then you've got everything in between. You've got the license partnerships for $500 million with one company to develop a whole standalone franchise for digital therapeutics in mental health, let's say. Or you've got others which are much more about let's leverage them for one brand or one product and see if they can work to actually enhance certain things, or can we actually just bring one thing to market as a co-development and co-commercialization partnership. So again, it spans the gamut, depends on the company, but again, I think it's more experimental and trial and error right now, rather than everybody's kind of said, I know exactly what I want to do with this.
Yeah, and I think that's a good answer, Shwen, because there is no one solution, and there may be partners which are potentially transformational for companies in certain areas of digital therapeutics or digital delivery of care even, and it can help with scalability where there are smaller margins, but a larger patient population may solve the business model. But is there a compelling offer to customers? Matthias, I want to shift to you and just get a sense of how GAIA does this. I have my assumptions about you're probably starting with specific, health systems in Germany where you're getting reimbursement first and working across the different regions and then different markets in Europe. But maybe you can give us a more nuanced answer about, sort of how GAIA rolls this out and thinks about the path to market for a new digital therapeutic and reaching, I understand automation, you're able to scale, right? You've built that into the model, but you still have to get the users and the customers there, right? So it can be reimbursed.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I can add anything to what Shwen said. I mean, it really differs in healthcare systems and settings where you're operating in, right? And some people say it's complicated, others say, well, it offers new ways of revenues. So is the glass half full or half empty, right? It's not the one pathway. Clearly defined in healthcare systems where we have general reimbursement like Germany, but others country by payer and state by state like in the US and in France. I think what helps us is that we have fully automated solutions, which are able to follow different pathways in different countries or with our partners. We also have partnerships with pharma companies to follow their ideas of commercialization in the respective healthcare system. So that helps us. The flexibility we have basically built in our products helps us to follow the different pathway. It probably lies a bit in the history of the company, because I know everybody said, oh, we have general reimbursement. It's just 2 years, right? We have 2 years general reimbursement. I think it was October 6th, 2020, when the first 2 products, which one of them was ours, was listed. That's 2 years. In healthcare, 2 years, I mean, Shwen can add on it, but it's nothing. Well, compared with nothing, right? It's a very short period, still a very short period. So all the 20 years before that, we had to keep the flexibility, even in our German market, to find pathways to get reimbursement and bring. And this flexibility helps us to follow the developments in the different countries and regions of the world, how to find the best way to implement the therapeutics. So, but I fully agree with friends. It really is it's not the one pathway there, at least at the moment.
Matthias, I think just to add on to your statement, 2 years is usually when the pharma company has another reorg and you have a new leader.
Yeah, that's about right. It might be 3 to 5 in pharma. But everything changes. New CEO, new CMO, new head of therapeutic area, new head of digital innovation. So I wanted to ask, or just pick up on something Shwen said. You mentioned, the 3 different customers you're selling to, and if we look at different markets, this can be interesting as well, right? Because you may have different drivers for those different customers, right? The patient, the physician, the payer, or the patient, the provider, and the payer in Europe versus the US. For example, in the US, a solution which keeps the patient from going to the doctor might, or the clinic might seem really interesting from a healthcare expenditure perspective and from an outcomes perspective. But for doctors and and clinics that bill per visit, it's actually counterproductive for them. They see this as damaging their business. So they might be more interested in more efficient visits with better impacts on outcomes, but they're generally not all that positive on the idea of fewer visits. Where in Europe, in a national health system with a single payer, this may get a lot of support because it's not impacting the actual MD's salary at the end of the day, but it is lightening their workload and generating better outcomes for the patient. So we really do have to think about these things. I had a question, but Naomi's asked one, which I think is a pretty good one. Shwen, you talked about healthcare versus sick care, and Naomi's got a comment here that said a recent BMJ article found that only 5% of NHS funding, so that's National Health System funding in the UK, is spent on prevention versus 95% on treatment. Right, so 95% is going to sick care, and 5% is going to prevention. How can business models for digital health help to address this? I think that's a challenging but interesting question.
Matthias? Well, the classic saying comes into mind: "There's no glory in prevention." And that's true for each and every perspective, right? Why should a patient? The problem with prevention from a patient perspective is you should do something for the benefit that something does not occur. I mean, that's prevention, right? You have to do something and the benefit you experience is that you don't experience anything. That makes prevention pretty hard. That's what you mentioned before, Christian, why so many, even, diabetes, all these sort of things. If you've never experienced getting blind from diabetes, it's hard to follow. And the thing is, Shwen, you're completely right. It's a sick care rather than healthcare. There's no money. It's not sure about the amount in, for example, in Germany, what they put in, but probably similar is that we try to manage the diseases rather to spend on prevention and preventive measures, because that might take 5 to 10 years before they pay off for the payer, because diabetes goes down. They look at their annual numbers and figures, and where you see no. So that is a trick. The good thing is, coming back to your question, is Christian. I think one of the good things of digital here is they are scalable. So you can, if you have the possibility, you can basically throw these preventive systems, if they are effective, you can throw them at your population, and you can scale it easily rather than other preventive, more complex solutions. So I think the scalability part of it can be a benefit when it comes to preventive measures, because you can easily apply it to your whole population rather quickly and broadly. Yeah. But otherwise, it's a tricky field.
Yeah, Matthias, if I could add on to that, Christian, I think the benefit of the scalability is also the data you can collect when you have a digital solution, right? Because I think a lot of the reason, to the point I made earlier, that we haven't figured out the reimbursement and regulation around this yet is because the incentives are aligned with the other way, which is about the treatment of sickness, not the benefit of prevention, right? Yeah. And as we go to a value-based world, as we go to a world where digital is in your pocket, on your wrist, and is everywhere that you can be and measuring all the time, we're going to get a lot more data for the value and benefit of detecting early, of treating beforehand, of actually how a digital solution can actually save you, as in the government, much more money, because you're not treating later on when it's much more expensive to actually cure the person or treat the person, rather by doing some things early at a lower cost and changing their behavior or changing their lifestyle in a way that's actually going to benefit them and not lead them down that path. So I think that's where incentives need to align, behavior needs to change, but the data is what's going to drive all this.
So yeah, that's incredibly interesting. And as I'm thinking about it, I was having a thought, which in the way my mind works, one thought triggers another one, and all of a sudden I'm somewhere else, which may be a little bit of ADHD, but it can also be efficient sometimes. In this case,
there's a digital therapeutic for that.
Yeah, I know. I want to manage it. I don't want to suppress it. I want to harness it, though. So in this case, I'm not sure if it's efficient yet, because I started thinking about, is there a need for a discussion of business models? I can see in health systems in Europe, maybe Germany pioneering this again, maybe France, maybe Spain, maybe Scandinavia, where there's some sort of consumer/health system collaboration, where those consumers that are interested, those patients that are interested to take some steps, can get some support on prevention from the health systems, because this is a massive healthcare economics and healthcare expenditure case in the long run, if we can prevent these conditions. But I was also thinking about the US. If we think about the subsector of the market that's going to the gym and also using wearables and using apps for their own health, and this may be, they may be using established digital health tools like WellDoc, or others for diabetes, or they may be looking at apps which help reduce their risk for Alzheimer's, especially after the Chris Hemsworth case. I mean, there's a bunch of apps out there that help you manage behavioral risk factors and reduce your risk profile. I wonder if, consumers have a role in sort of pushing the payers and the health systems to get on board with some of these apps in certain areas, whether it's discounts or reimbursements. I just wonder if there's a rollout strategy which could be developed over time. But going from prevention back to digital therapeutics, the same could apply. Let's say we look at migraine or depression, right? Treating either with a digital therapeutic could not only reduce healthcare expenditure, it could reduce side effects and additional healthcare costs, but taking a pill is easier, right? So is there a need the same way for the health systems long-term? By health systems, I mean payers, you know, in Europe, or the private and nonprofit payers in the US, whether they're nonprofit or not is something else. But is there a need for them to look at this in terms of the economics of it? Should digital therapeutics be used more than they are as an alternative to existing pharmaceutical interventions, which can be much more expensive and pose more complications? Now, there isn't always a suitable alternative digital therapeutic, right? And sometimes they're complementary, as you pointed out. But are we there yet, or do we need to see more progress, Matthias, of the sort that you never expected to see in your lifetime, you know, from the health systems? You know, I wonder, because I think about that, treating depression with pharmaceuticals can work, but it doesn't always. And if there are digital interventions which can improve outcomes and reduce the need for pharmaceuticals, this could be very compelling from a health system side. And we shouldn't ignore the fact that a number of pharma companies are actively exploring not just companion digital health, but alternative care journeys, right, via digital health as well. I don't have an answer to this, but I think clearly the incentives aren't there yet to enable all the business models that we should be seeing. And I just wonder about your thoughts on this. And I think we're probably going to wrap up in a minute, but I think that's a good one to, you know, where do we need to go from here? Either in terms of pricing and reimbursement and incentives, and maybe as a final question, and you can answer either one of these, if you were starting a digital therapeutics company now, what do you wish somebody, you know, if you were doing this without your prior experience, what would be the one thing you would want somebody to tell you now as you were starting out on this journey?
Don't do it. No, I'm just kidding.
Best answer of the week.
Matthias, it sounds perfect question for you, since you've been there 20 years now.
Well, I'm not, look at my gray hairs. I'm not sure if you can, but I'm not sure if I would do it again. Oh, but no. I think we've touched quite a few of the aspects already, right? It's not an easy catch. Healthcare is a beast, and I think it's a fascinating field. Digital therapeutics is a fascinating field. Coming back to your point, is we're gonna see a more broader use. I'm pretty sure, because we're gonna see more that, you know, patients who are not eligible for drugs, who don't want to take drugs, or they need both, or whatever. So we find many. It's gonna be, hopefully rather sooner than later, it's gonna be another tool in the toolkit for clinicians and therapists, where they can say they're gonna make their way. It might gonna take some time and education and persistency, but we're gonna get there. If you start a new company, it's like you have to be clear what it means if you enter healthcare. It's not disrupting, like, nobody wants to disrupt the healthcare system, right? Everybody's talking about disruption in healthcare. Nobody wants that. The healthcare system is disrupted enough already. It's the way, is how do you find your way in the system? And what does that mean? What does it mean if you go down the scientific route? What does it mean to run clinical trials and regulatory pathways, et cetera, et cetera? What does it mean to you? What are the caveats you should keep in mind? But otherwise, go for it. I think there's a definite future for digital therapeutics, many areas to be, but it's not. You know, there a few years ago, Shwen probably remembers that people were talking about what's the next Uber in healthcare. That was a technical term people were using, right? It was the Uber in healthcare. But it's not that easy that you have, you digitalize basically your platform strategy, you digitalize transportation from A to Z, B, basically in a way. It's not how healthcare works. Healthcare is more difficult, it's more tricky. There's more caveats, there's more people, it's complex, it's a beast. These are all these things. And that you should keep in mind if you enter the space now. Even if I sound a bit disillusional, but if you keep this in mind, you can have a fantastic time in this field.
So I think that's really good advice, and I think the Uber analogy is even worse than you just pointed out, because the Uber guys had a couple of failed Me Too businesses before Uber, and Uber was also a Me Too where they saw a model and said, let's do this, but they, having had a couple of companies, they had a really good network of investors and were able to better resource it and scale, right? And that is not so likely a case in digital health, where somebody has a model and it's just a question of scaling it as quickly as possible, right? You have this whole clinical development and regulatory process to go through. So, but granted, it's a challenging space. There's a lot of need. I think we'll see more of it. We'll see more and more use, as you say, and we'll need to continue looking at the models. I think we touched on some interesting things here. I appreciate both of you joining us. I realize the digital events aren't as fun or as interactive as the in-person events. And I invite everybody to come and join us in Lisbon next October. We'll post the exact dates in a few weeks. I did want to say on this, for a more controversial session, tomorrow at 9 a.m. Eastern, we'll have John Krakauer from MindMaze, who's going to present the digital therapeutics as an alternative patient care journey for neurological patients. And John is a neurologist and psychiatrist, dual qualified, has some strong views on this about the existing care journey is broken, and therefore the digital care journey is providing better results in certain conditions. So I'm going to encourage everyone to join that. And we'll keep going this week, but the goal is to bring everyone back together in person with some in-person partnering and some really larger panels, very interactive with the audience. And I want to thank you, Matthias, and thank you, Shwen, and I look forward to following up. And I'd like to thank Patrick and Joost and Connor at Biotechgate for running these digital partnerings. For those of you not doing the partnering, check it out. If you don't do it in this meeting, use it in the next one. It's a great tool to reach potential partners around the world and to do it, without having to travel. We all like the in-person meetings, but even post-COVID, these digital partnering meetings with some 1,400 participants in biotech and health and digital health, it's pretty useful. So check it out, even if you're not scheduling meetings this week. Thanks to our panelists, and I hope to see you tomorrow for the talk with John Krakauer of MindMaze and Johns Hopkins, and then our mental health session on digital mental health and digital delivery of care on Thursday. So guys, thanks a lot. Matthias, have a great afternoon. Shwen, enjoy the day. I think it's a bit warmer in Boston than it is here. And I hope to see you guys all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.